지방을 먹으면 에너지가 넘친다는데 왜 나는 더 피곤하고 더부룩할까? 혹시 키토를 시작했지만 지방 섭취를 늘리고 나서 오히려 불편함을 느끼셨나요? 그건 전혀 이상한 일이 아닙니다. 처음엔 누구나 그럴 수 있어요. 식단을 바꾼다고 해서 몸이 곧바로 적응하진 못하니까요. 여러분의 몸은 아직 지방을 에너지로 잘 쓰지 못하는 상태일 수 있습니다. 이럴 때는 부작용을 참고 억지로 밀어붙이기보다는 변화의 속도를 조절하는 전략이 필요합니다. 그리고 하나 더, 반드시 지방을 많이 먹어야 한다는 생각에 너무 얽매일 필요는 없어요. 저희 채널에서는 주로 키토제닉 식단을 다루고 있지만 단편적인 이론이나 하나의 틀에 얽매이기보다는 유연하게 식단을 바라볼 수 있도록 여러 전문가들의 다양한 관점을 소개하고 있습니다. 건강을 회복하거나 체중을 감량하는 길은 하나만 있는 것이 아닙니다. 따라서 특정 방식을 맞다 틀리다 섣불리 단정하기보다는 여러 전문가들의 이야기를 들어보고 자신에게 맞는 방향을 찾아가시면 좋겠습니다. 오늘 소개해드릴 테드 네이먼 박사는 단백질을 중심으로 식단을 구성하는 다이어트를 개발한 미국의 가정의학 전문의입니다. 그는 지방 중심의 키토제닉 식단을 지지하지 않으며 오히려 비판적인 시각을 갖고 있습니다. 식이지방 섭취를 늘리는 것이 몸에 잘 맞지 않았던 분들이라면 오늘 인터뷰 내용을 꼭 끝까지 들어주세요.
Now, Dr. Naiman is a primary care doctor here in Seattle, and he has his own story about how he transitioned from predominantly vegetarian Adventist life, both at family and in medical school, to learning about the benefits of a low-carb lifestyle. But what separates Ted from sort of your average low-carb doctor or your average low-carb enthusiast is he's not so much in the camp of the low-carb high-fat. Ted is really big on protein and the importance of protein. And it's amazing how protein as a macronutrient can be so controversial. Now remember, we don't eat fats and we don't eat proteins, we eat real foods, but the percentages matter. And there's this concern or this fear about getting too much protein. So hearing Ted's perspective is very interesting from that standpoint, because it's a message that we don't hear a lot of, and it's still controversial, some of it, but I think it's a great perspective. Now, he's also known as the exercise guy. If you've seen his before and after pictures, he's ripped. I mean, this guy is built and fit, not super bulky, but fit and trimmed, great lean body mass. And he does it on 15 minutes a day of exercise, which makes a lot of people unhappy and upset at him. But he gives us some of his secrets and some of his tips about how to achieve that. And more importantly, how to do it safely for people who maybe don't have an experience in exercise. And let's be honest, not everybody's going to get the results he has, but the importance of exercise, how it contributes to health, is still a crucial concept that maybe doesn't get enough emphasis, because although exercise may not be the key to weight loss, there are some other components about maintaining lean muscle mass and strength that can be very important for health and recovering from episodes where you may have struggles with your health. He's got a very relaxed approach to things, a very relaxed attitude that hopefully you'll appreciate. In the world of low carb and social media, you're sort of known as the protein guy and the exercise guy. But it wasn't always that case, right? Like I heard some stories about your upbringing and your background, and very different. I mean, you were brought up in an Adventist tradition, and you went to school at Lomalinda, which is a Seventh-day Adventist school, which is sort of the contrary to high protein and low carb. So tell us about your transition, about what you learned growing up in that type of environment, and how your thought process differs and how that change happened.
Okay, yeah, sure. So yes, I was raised in an Adventist tradition, and Adventists, of course, are famous for being vegetarians. And my upbringing was that, basically animal fat and cholesterol and saturated fat was really terrible. And the goal was to eat as many plants as possible. And so I had this really healthy diet on paper where I was eating lots of whole grains and, just basically lots of whole wheat and that kind of thing. And it was supposedly the healthiest diet, right? And then I went to Loma Linda Medical Center. And of course, Loma Linda is this famous blue zone where everybody is vegetarian. And it's sort of an Adventist vegetarian mecca. And my personal experience was that I was never in really great shape, right? My body composition was not that great. I was not that healthy. I had a lot of issues. I had, really bad eczema, and I had really bad body composition, and I didn't feel particularly healthy at all. And so what I ended up realizing is that, oh, diet doesn't matter, right? Diet's not a big deal, because here I am eating the healthiest diet you possibly could, and I'm in really bad shape, right?
Yeah.
So clearly diet is not that important. And honestly, even though Lomalinda is a diet-based, institution, they're very big into diet and lifestyle. Even there, my training was basically, okay, if somebody's having bad health outcomes, it's mostly genetic, right? If you're obese, it's genetic. If both your parents are obese, 80% chance you're going to be obese. If you have type 2 diabetes, it's mostly genetic. Well, that's because your parent was diabetic or your grandparent. And so I got this training that, oh yes, diet is important. You should never eat meat. But at the same time, if you get a bad outcome, you can blame it on your genetics, and you should just feel sorry for people who are overweight or diabetic. They can't help it because their parents were overweight or diabetic. So you do the best you can, and you just give them more and more drugs, right?
Yeah.
So this is my mindset. It's like, okay, diet is important, almost from a religious point of view. You should not eat animals, and you'll be healthy. And then if something bad happens to you, it's really just bad genetics, right?
So when you started your practice, that was still the mindset you had when you were seeing patients one after the other.
Well, this was my mindset in medical school and in my first year of internship.
Okay.
So I did my internship in South Carolina, which was just the diabetes and obesity capital of the country at the time. And I saw just a ton of pathology, just like every diabetic complication you could imagine, just over and over and over again. So here I am in residency with this clinic with just tons of diabetes pathology, and everybody's just slowly getting worse, right? They're getting fatter and more diabetic, and amputations and blindness and kidney failure and the whole thing. And really, I'm just there feeling sorry for people because I think, wow, such bad genetics. How could you? You just can't overcome that, right? It's not your fault. You're just born that way.
Right.
And then really it was a patient of mine who came in one day and, wow, he'd lost 30 pounds and his blood sugar was totally normal. And he told me, I feel great. And I asked him, I said, what did you do? You have to tell me what you did so I can tell everybody else to do the same thing, right?
Yeah.
And this guy pulls out a copy of the Atkins book, and he's like, I went on this Atkins diet where I just didn't eat carbs, and bam, I feel fantastic. And that blew my mind, because never had I seen anyone go on a vegetarian diet, and have this miraculous transformation. This is my first experience with diet as a huge lever for health, and it was a big deal.
Were you interested to jump in right away, or were you still like, yeah, but that can't really be healthy? I'm sure there's something to that that's more concerning. Or did you resist it right away because you're training, or were you open right away to it?
Oh, no. I was like, this is the coolest thing I've ever seen. I was so excited, and I will never forget what happened to me. I went to my instructors in residency, and I was like, look at this guy. He lost all this weight. His blood sugar's down. His blood pressure's down. His A1C's down. He lost a bunch of weight. He looks like $1 million. And well, they looked at me and they said, yeah, what happened to his total cholesterol? And I hadn't really paid any attention to it, And so I looked at it and I was like, oh, yeah, well, it did, I guess, go up 20 points. So I was crestfallen, and my instructors were like, oh, good job, Naaman. He probably had a heart attack in the parking lot.
Oh my
and you're
God.
basically going to kill people. And they told me under no circumstances could I recommend this diet. And this was just a bad idea. So, but that was the spark, And then in residency, we were required to do a research paper, and I started researching basically macronutrients and health. And that was about 20 years ago. And back then it was a lot harder to do research, but I found all this evidence that, wow, people are eating way more carbohydrates than they probably should.
Yeah.
And I've been doing this low carb thing now for 20 years.
Wow. So was it that residency experience that made you change personally? I mean, they may have tried to prevent you from helping your patients that way, but did you help yourself that way right away in residency?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I personally had a massive health transformation from going on a low carb diet. I was definitely skinny fat. I was never really fat, but I definitely lost about 20 pounds, and my body composition improvements were huge. And, my before and afters are not that dramatic, but it felt really dramatic to me.
Yeah. Well, that's important. I mean, how you feel. There's one thing we do a lot of, look at the difference visually, but how you feel is even more important than the difference visually, isn't
Right.
it? Yeah. So once you got out of residency and got into practice, did you just hit the ground running as a low-carb doctor, using that as an intervention right away in people?
Oh, yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
I've basically been recommending carb restriction for my whole 20-year career now. And initially, it was really under the radar because I was worried about this total cholesterol. I mean, who knew
Yeah.
what was going to happen? This has got to be bad, right? But, thankfully, as time goes on, thanks to things like Diet Doctor, the legitimacy is definitely increasing, and it's a lot easier to practice low-carb medicine.
테드 네이먼 박사가 자라온 로마린다는 미국 캘리포니아에 위치한 도시입니다. 장수마을을 연구해온 댄 뷰트너 박사가 선정한 5개의 블루존 중 하나이며, 특히 이곳은 제7일 안식일 예수재림교회 신도들이 전체 인구의 3분의 1가량을 차지할 정도로 재림교 전통이 강한 지역이라고 합니다. 이들은 육류 섭취를 철저히 제한하고 통곡물, 견과류, 콩류 등을 중심으로 한 채식 위주의 식단을 따른다고 하는데요. 이는 국내에서 선풍적인 인기를 끌고 있는 저속노화 식단을 떠오르게 합니다. 많은 분들은 이 식단이 건강에 도움이 된다고 믿고 실천하고 있습니다. 테드 네이먼 박사는 그런 환경 속에서 평생 채식 위주의 식단을 해왔지만 오히려 건강 상태가 좋지 않았다고 말합니다. 그러던 중 그는 한 환자의 놀라운 변화를 접했고 자신의 식단을 다시 바라보게 됩니다. 그리고 지도교수들의 반대에도 불구하고 그는 이 식단에 대해 직접 연구하기 시작합니다. 그 환자가 실천했던 애킨스 다이어트는 지금 우리가 알고 있는 현대 저탄고지 식단의 기초가 된 방식입니다. 이 책은 출간된 지 수십 년이 지났지만 현재도 해외 키토 전문가들 사이에서 자주 언급되고 있으며 국내에서도 최근 우리 실정에 맞게 잘 번역되어 소개되고 있습니다. 관심 있으신 분들은 영상 하단의 상품 정보를 참고해주세요. 이 경험을 통해 우리는 테드 박사의 성향을 조금은 엿볼 수 있습니다. 그는 자신의 오랜 믿음보다 눈앞의 변화와 결과를 더 무겁게 여기는 사람, 그리고 권위로 무장한 말보다 실제 경험과 데이터에서 답을 찾으려는 사람인 것 같습니다. 이 이야기에는 중요한 교훈이 있습니다. 우리는 미디어에서 유명한 박사가 추천하거나 유명한 대학에서 발표했다는 이유만으로 그 방법이 정답이라고 믿고 쉽게 믿어버리는 경향이 있죠. 하지만 그런 정보는 편향된 교육과 상업적인 의도가 맞물린 정보일 가능성이 있습니다. 이런 정보만 믿고 곧바로 자신의 몸에 그 방식을 적용하는 건 너무 위험합니다. 여러분의 몸은 그 누구보다 소중하니까요. 결국 중요한 건 각자에게 잘 맞는 방법을 찾는 것입니다. 이를 위해서는 비판적인 시각과 열린 마음, 두 가지를 동시에 가지고 정보를 바라봐야 합니다.
Yeah, great to hear. Now, you use the word low carb and low carb medicine, and that frequently is used interchangeably with ketosis and ketogenic medicine, I guess you could say. But they're not always the same. So do you draw a line in differentiating them and when you would use one or the other, or the benefits are one or the other? Just give us an idea of how you see the difference between low carb and keto.
Right. I don't really use the word keto because I'm not telling anyone to track ketone levels. It doesn't seem to be super necessary. And I know that anyone who's restricting carbs, even below about 100 grams a day, is going to be at least in a light ketosis, off and on. And so I see it on a spectrum or a continuum. And for me, just plain old low carb is good enough because that does imply a significant amount of ketosis. And so for me, keto, the popular keto diet for me is kind of evolved into something where you're just going out of your way to eat a ton of fat and drive your ketone levels up as high as possible. And I think that at a certain point that becomes more bad than good. And so I don't really focus on ketone levels or make sure you eat enough fat to be in extreme ketosis at all times. So I just like the carbohydrate restriction side of keto.
Yeah, it's a fascinating discussion because it seems like there are some people who need to get into ketosis to break down barriers or move forward, and some people are going to thrive on a lower carb, not worrying about ketosis, and trying to find who's in what camp can just happen with self-experimentation. But it sounds like for most people, or pretty much for everybody, you're not even really that concerned about it. You say just cut the carbs down to about 100 grams and you're going to improve.
Right. And the reality is that everyone thinks of ketosis as some sort of binary switch, but it's just this slow, gradual continuum from making tiny amounts of ketones to making a whole bunch of ketones. And all of these biological processes are happening at all times in everyone. So everyone's generating a tiny amount of ketones at all times. And then as you restrict more and more carbohydrate or expend more energy, your ketone levels go up, and it's because it's on a spectrum. I don't really say, oh, right now at this second you're in ketosis, and then an hour later, oh, now you're not in ketosis. It's just, I don't like thinking about it in this binary fashion.
How about the adaptation process, though? I mean, it seems like it's, for some people, they really have to make a jump to help their body kind of flip a switch, like you said, and then they can sort of back off and go in and out of ketosis. But to get into it for a first time and train your body to get off of all that glucose and sugar that you've been burning for so long, that maybe it takes a little bit more of an extreme step than just 100 grams of low carb. Have you found that to be the case at all?
Well, I think, fat adaptation is a huge big deal, and that's very real, and you really have to upregulate the ability to run your whole metabolism off of fat. And I think that's a slow and gradual process, and you'll find a lot of people who will tell you that they can't perform athletically as well as they could for months after adopting a low-carb diet, just because you're slowly upregulating the ability to generate a bunch of ATP from fat at a high enough rate. And actually, I feel like this is unrelated to just making ketones. So like, I could take anyone off the street and just tell them to not eat carbs for 16, 18, 20, 24 hours, and they're going to be fully generating ketones. But they're going to feel awful, and they're going to be starving, and their exercise performance is going to nosedive. And now you're talking about the process of fat adaptation, which to me is totally different than just making ketones, which honestly, anyone on any high carb diet could just not eat carbs for 16 to 24 hours and they're in ketosis. So to me, it's not so much about the ketones, it's more about fat adaptation and getting better at running your whole metabolism off of fat.
Yeah, and so much of this has to do with our insulin levels and our glucagon levels and that ratio, and being able to train our body to have lower insulin levels, which is required for ketosis. I'm not putting words in your mouth, but it seems like of the two, lower insulin and higher ketones, you would be much more interested in just focusing on the insulin and forgetting about the ketones. Would that be accurate?
Correct. Yeah. I mean, for me, I think the ketones come along for the ride.
Yeah.
제가 테드 네이먼 박사를 여러분께 소개하고 싶었던 가장 큰 이유는 바로 케토시스라는 대사 상태에 대해 이렇게 유연하게 접근하는 방식 때문이었습니다. 저는 키토 식단을 알고 나서도 한동안 실천을 망설였었는데요. 그걸 시작하면 계속해서 지방을 주 에너지원으로 사용하는 케토시스 상태를 유지해야만 한다고 생각했기 때문이었습니다. 쉽게 말해 엄두가 나지 않았던 거죠. 실제로 저희 채널에서 키토식을 하는 많은 분들이 댓글로 이거 먹어도 돼요? 이건 먹으면 안 돼요? 이렇게 하면 틀린 건가요? 이렇게 정답을 확인하려는 분들이 정말 많습니다. 그만큼 식단을 엄격하게 지켜야 한다는 부담을 느끼는 거죠. 저도 처음엔 그런 생각 때문에 오랫동안 망설였고 힘들었던 기억이 있어서 그 심정을 충분히 이해합니다. 하지만 여러분이 치료적인 목적이 아닌 건강 개선과 감량을 목적으로 한다면 매일 24시간 케토시스 상태를 유지할 필요는 없습니다. 저는 기본적으로 탄수화물 70g가량을 허용하는 저탄수 식단을 실천하고 있지만 때때로 더 먹는 날이 있다고 해서 죄책감을 느끼진 않아요. 우리가 언제나 집에서만 계획대로 식사할 수 있는 건 아니니까요. 지방을 주 에너지원으로 활용하는 키토제닉 식단을 도구로 적극 활용하지만 또 거기에 너무 얽매이지는 않는 거죠. 그 균형이 중요하다는 걸 테드 네이먼 박사의 설명이 잘 보여줬다고 생각합니다. 여러분께도 이 이야기가 실천의 문턱을 낮추고 키토 식단에 대해 더 유연한 방향을 찾는 데 도움이 되었으면 좋겠습니다. 이제 다음은 네이먼 박사의 전문 분야이자 많은 분들이 걱정하는 단백질이라는 주제로 넘어갑니다.
Yeah. So when it comes to a low carb diet or a ketogenic diet, how to formulate it in what percentages can certainly vary from person to person. And one of the biggest areas of controversy is protein. All right, we sort of all agree you limit the fat. We all agree you limit the carbohydrates, and then you eat the proper amount of protein and you can fill in the rest with fat. So the discussion comes around what is the proper amount of protein. And, it's such an interesting discussion. And going back to the RDA, the recommended daily allowance of protein, you see ranges out there from 10% of your calories to 0.8 grams per kilogram to 0.3 grams per pound, which is really a small amount of protein, but somehow that's the recommended daily allowance. So help us understand what this RDA of protein means and how it can be so small compared to what we're used to.
Right. So the RDA is just a bare absolute minimum where below which you're going to be just abjectly deficient. And the RDA in no way suggests how much protein you should eat. It's just how much protein you should never, ever, ever, ever go below. So that's a really important concept. It's almost impossible to eat quote unquote too much protein. You basically can't do it. So it's very, very possible to not eat enough protein and have protein deficiencies, which is horrible and very severe, and you'll actually die. So the RDA is just there to tell you what to not go below. In no way does that suggest how much you should be eating.
Yeah, and I think that's such an important point, because when we talk about the RDA for vitamin A or vitamin D or omega-3s or whatever, calcium and vitamin C, it's sort of accepted that it's a minimum.
Right.
But somehow when we talk to protein, certain nutritional sects have turned that into a maximum, that we shouldn't go above it. But it was never intended that way.
It was never intended that way, and I really don't even know where that comes from.
Yeah. Well, so then there is some legitimate concern, though, about, well, what if we are eating too much protein? So I guess it can come from three different perspectives. One is longevity, right? That the concern that too much protein harms longevity, lower proteins improves longevity. Two is this, almost mythical stimulation of mTOR and how that affects with protein. And three is ketogenesis, with gluconeogenesis and kicking you out of ketosis. So let's take each one of those individually, starting with the last one. So gluconeogenesis. It's a big word, basically creating new glucose in your body from something else, and frequently from protein. Is it real? Does it happen?
Gluconeogenesis is constantly occurring, and your liver is making every bit of glucose you ever need all the time, 100% of the time, whether you're eating carbs or not. And gluconeogenesis is demand-driven. If you need more glucose, you'll do more gluconeogenesis, but it's not supply-driven. So eating extra protein does not increase gluconeogenesis.
But then you see all these reports of people who are following a ketogenic diet, and they increase their protein intake and their ketones disappear or decrease.
Right.
So what's the explanation there?
Yeah, I think you will suppress ketones if you eat more protein. That's absolutely true.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So I guess your point would be then, since I'm not concerned about a ketogenic diet, I don't care if gluconeogenesis is happening and ketones are going down. As long as you're still following carb restriction, you're still being healthy, and health trumps ketosis. Would that be an adequate statement for?
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. So people who are on carnivore diets and eating much higher levels of protein, any concerns there with getting too much?
Not really. Basically, even in medical circles, up to 35% protein seems to be fine. And nobody's seen any problems with protein levels that high.
Yeah.
And, hunter-gatherers were eating, at least 19 to 35% protein in their diet. And so I don't really see any problem from carnivore diets. Usually your average person on a carnivore diet is eating about 30% protein, and in no way do I think that's too much.
Great. And what about this concept of mTOR, right? mTOR being a very important nutrient sensor and growth stimulator in our body. Without it being stimulated, we would not grow, we would not develop muscles. But with it being stimulated too much, there's concern that it's going to cause abnormal cell growth, so cancer cell growth. How do you wrap your head around the concerns of mTOR with too much protein?
Well, I think that there's definitely this sort of yin and yang to anabolism and catabolism, and you have to go back and forth, and you have to have some of each, and you have to have feasting, and you have to have fasting. And my advice is just keep insulin pulsatile, by just not eating all the time. and I think you'll probably be fine. I'm not convinced that eating more fat and less protein is going to be longevity benefit to anyone. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I know this is controversial, and I'm a big fan of Dr. Rosedale, and a lot of people out there think, if you can just squeak by with the very lowest amount of protein, you're going to live longer. But I don't think we have any data in humans to support that at all. And honestly, look at elderly people in America. American adults aged 70 to 79 eat 66 grams of protein a day and 247 grams of carbohydrates. So I really don't think protein restriction is that beneficial, because those people are restricting the hell out of protein and their outcomes are not necessarily that great on average.
Yeah, frequently we talk about protein from eating too much standpoint, but what's not talked about enough is how the requirements probably go up even higher as we age.
Right.
And the risk of sarcopenia and not having enough muscle mass and falls and fractures. Do you think that could be almost completely abolished with increased protein intake?
Absolutely. I mean, the reality is the stronger you are, the longer you're going to live. The more muscle mass you have, the longer you're going to live. Falls are one of the biggest killers of elderly people. And if you're restricting protein for some sort of theoretical longevity benefit that's never been demonstrated in humans, you're basically risking some very real osteoporosis and sarcopenia for some theoretical longevity benefits that just haven't been demonstrated. So I think it's a horrible idea. I don't, Walter Longo, all of his data is from mice, and we have zero human data to support protein restriction. So until I see some sort of data in humans, I'm probably not going to restrict protein.
국내에서도 단백질은 가장 큰 주목을 받고 있는 영양소 중 하나입니다. 한쪽에서는 단백질의 중요성이 강조되기도 하고, 또 다른 한쪽에서는 단백질이 노화의 주범이라면서 하루 단백질 권장 섭취량, 즉 체중 1kg당 0.8g 이상을 넘기지 말라고 합니다. 저도 테드 네이먼 박사처럼 kg당 0.8g이라는 수치는 이만큼 먹어야 한다고 하는 권장량이 아니라 이것보다 적게 먹으면 안 된다고 경고하는 최소 권장 기준으로 이해해야 한다고 생각합니다. 그럼 이제 반대 진영의 주장을 살펴보죠. 이건 국내에서도 첨예하게 대립하고 있는 주제라 조금 자세히 이야기해 보겠습니다. 단백질이 과도하면 노화가 촉진된다는 주장은 저속노화를 주장하는 유명한 노년내과 의사가 주도하고 있습니다. 그분은 주장의 근거로 단백질, 특히 붉은 고기와 같은 동물성 단백질이 mTOR와 IGF-1을 자극하고 이것은 노화를 가속시킨다고 말하죠. 심지어 mTOR를 노화의 가속 페달이라고 표현하기도 했습니다. 하지만 이런 설명은 mTOR와 IGF-1의 생리적 역할을 단편적으로 해석한 것입니다. mTOR는 우리 몸의 세포 성장, 회복, 면역 반응에 핵심적으로 작용하는 중요한 신경 전달 물질입니다. IGF-1 역시 성장 호르몬과 함께 뼈와 근육 유지, 회복을 돕는 중요한 호르몬이죠. 인슐린도 마찬가지예요. 혈중의 인슐린이 지속적으로 높게 유지되는 게 문제지 일시적인 상승과 하강은 자연스러운 생리작용입니다. 이들 호르몬을 무조건 억제해야 할 대상으로 보면 몸의 성장, 회복, 면역작용 자체가 위협받을 수 있습니다. 그 교수님은 평소 중용을 강조하지만 이 호르몬에 대해서는 오히려 편향된 시각을 가진 것으로 보입니다. 네이먼 박사는 우리는 섭식과 단식을 오가야 하고 그것이 간헐적으로 오르내리면 문제가 되지 않는다고 말합니다. 그러니 조심해야 할 건 단백질 자체가 아니라 끊임없이 먹는 것, 그리고 많이 먹는 것입니다. 붉은 고기도 많이 먹고 밥도 많이 먹고 간식도 많이 먹는다면 확실히 노화를 가속시키는 조건이 됩니다. 하지만 탄수화물 섭취를 낮추고 단백질과 지방을 균형 있게 섭취하는 키토식단에서는 이에 대해 걱정할 필요가 없다고 생각합니다. 여러분은 이제 선택할 수 있습니다. 근거가 빈약한 관찰 연구를 근거로 하는 그들의 주장대로 동물성 단백질과 붉은 고기 섭취를 줄일 것인지, 아니면 건강한 노년을 위해 근육 유지를 도와줄 단백질을 적극적으로 섭취할 것인지를 말이죠. 이제 두 사람은 계속해서 단백질에 대한 논의를 이어나갑니다.
Yeah, longevity data is such a minefield because, you need 30, 40, 50-year studies to really prove it. So it's trying to draw best conclusions from the data that's there. And a lot of the times that can come from overstating the quality of the evidence and the support that you have for your opinions, can it?
Right.
Yeah.
It's bad.
It's bad. Good summary. It's bad. And then there's the issue of how our bodies respond to protein depending on our insulin sensitivity. And had a great talk with Professor Ben Bickman, who likes to talk about research from Dr. Cahill and others, showing that our insulin and glucagon ratio and our insulin response to protein is very different depending on our baseline metabolic health and insulin sensitivity. So do you see any concerns in someone who is fairly insulin resistant at baseline, fighting with metabolic syndrome, who hasn't really gotten a handle on it yet, eating too much protein then because of the insulinogenic response from it?
No, I actually have bigger concerns about that person eating unrestricted amounts of fat,